Afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, and welcome to the fourth session of National Security in the Shadow of COVID-19. This bipartisan series brings together members and staff to think through key foreign policy and national security issues. Some of our earlier conversations focused on how the ongoing pandemic and its aftermath might complicate the international security environment. And as we head into the 117th Congress and a Biden administration, this session will focus on the panorama of global threats facing the United States and the prospects for bipartisan cooperation to confront those threats within a narrowly divided Congress and between the president and Congress. So we'll also discuss the president's proposed drawdown of US troops from Afghanistan and Iraq, which aims to cut the US presence to 2,500 troops in both countries by mid-January. That proposal has been met with considerable resistance from both parties in Congress, as reflected in this year's defense authorization bill, which faces a potential veto from the president on this and on other grounds. You know, the broader goal of this briefing series is to inform Congress's thinking so that we're better prepared to craft legislation, conduct oversight, and talk about complex international security threats and challenges with our constituents. So to frame this session, I'll offer some very short remarks before I turn it over to our very special guest, General H.R. McMaster, who had a distinguished military career and served as National Security Advisor from 2017 to 2018. Look, there's no shortage of national security threats facing our country. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, the failed state of Venezuela, the spread and potential use of nuclear weapons, and terrorism all sit atop this daunting list of challenges. And to this list, I think we have to add pandemic.This, and climate change. While they may not be considered national security threats in the narrowest sense of the term, they pose a clear and present danger to the American people. And in the case of pandemic.This, we've lost more Americans to COVID-19 than were lost on the battlefields of World War II. Not one of these threats can be effectively addressed by the United States alone. And in each case, an effective response requires us to cooperate with other countries. And here at home, confronting those challenges will require bipartisan cooperation at a uniquely partisan moment in American political life. And so to the greatest extent possible, Democrats and Republicans have to set aside our differences and work together as patriots first and foremost. So to help us think through the national security threats we'll face in the next Congress and to help assess the prospects for bipartisan cooperation, I can think of no one better than General McMaster. As I mentioned, he served as National Security Advisor from 2017 to 2018, which was the capstone to a 34-year career in the Army. He holds a PhD in military history and was a professor at West Point, his alma mater. Go Army, beat Navy. He's the author of an award-winning book, Dereliction of Duty, and he just published another book called Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. General, it's an honor to serve alongside you on the West Point Board of Visitors, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you. One quick housekeeping note before I turn it over. This session is intended to be a conversation, and we have plenty of time for Q&A after the General gives his opening remarks. Members of Congress and members of the press, please signal your interest in speaking by using the raise hand feature of Zoom, and I'll call on you when it's your turn. For staffers, please type your question into the Q&A feature of Zoom. So with that, General, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your hard-earned expertise. I'll turn it over to you now for your opening remarks.
Congresswoman Murphy, what a privilege it is to be with you, and thank you for this venue, what you're doing to generate bipartisan understanding of the greatest challenges we face so we can work together to build a better future for generations to come. And I'll say the whole purpose of what you're doing is consistent with the purpose of the book that I just finished. What I hope to do with Battlegrounds is contribute to a more full understanding of those challenges we face, as a way not only to craft a more effective approach to foreign policy, but a more consistent long-term approach to foreign policy, of course. And to do that, it requires really bipartisan support and the ability to work together and in a sustained manner over time. So, and it is my hope as well that maybe it's in the arena of foreign policy that we can begin to reverse the polarization we see in our society, because this is an area that really there ought to be some major points of agreement. So I thought what I'd do is introduce just a few themes and then to get into some specifics concerning the degree to which a new Biden administration should approach foreign policy with both elements of continuity and change in mind. And I think we would all agree that we can no longer afford for new administrations to define their foreign policy mainly as an opposition to the administration that preceded them, because there ought to be both elements of continuity and change. I think it's really important for us to understand that elements of continuity in policy will have among them the actions of others, especially our adversaries, our enemies, and our rivals. And in Battlegrounds, I introduced this theme of strategic narcissism. And that is our tendency, especially since the end of the Cold War, to define the world mainly in relation to us and to assume that either what we choose to do or to not do will be decisive to achieving a favorable outcome. Now, this is a problematic approach to foreign policy and national security. First of all, because it's self-referential and it doesn't acknowledge the agency, the influence, the authorship over the future that the other has. And this is, I think, the principal cause of our diminished strategic competence since the end of the Cold War. And so just broadly, I would introduce this theme by observing, I think, that at the end of the Cold War, we entered a period of confidence. And we had reason to be confident, right? We had won the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapsed. And as the Soviet Union was collapsing, we had this lopsided military victory over the fourth largest army in the world during Desert Storm. But it was during this period of confidence in the 1990s that many of us accepted three fundamental assumptions about the post-Cold War world. First, that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. An assumption related to that is that great power competition was a relic of the past. And a third assumption, which grew mainly out of Desert Storm, was that America's technological military prowess would guarantee our security far into the future. And this assumption underpinned this orthodoxy of the revolution in military affairs in the 1990s. The next war was going to be fundamentally different from all wars that had gone before it. It could be waged quickly, cheaply, efficiently, in a standoff range. If you remember the defense language at the time, you couldn't read a sentence in defense concepts without the word dominance appearing, right? Full spectrum dominance and rapid decisive operations. Okay, who's going to be against that? Are you going to be for ponderous indecisive operations? And so these were concepts that breathed well, but neglected continuities in foreign policy, continuities in geopolitics, and continuities in the very nature of war. And these assumptions, I would argue, were a setup. They were a setup for the strategic shocks and difficulties that we encountered in the 2000s. And in particular, of course, the mass murder attacks of 9/11, the most devastating terrorist attacks in history, in which a brutal and determined enemy used box cutters and airplanes to bypass our military prowess. As my friend, the historian Conrad Crane says, right? There are two ways to fight: asymmetrically and stupidly. And you hope that your enemy picks stupidly, as Saddam Hussein did in 1991, but others are likely to learn vicariously from the fate of militaries like Saddam's and fight us asymmetrically. And then, of course, we had the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And while we often want to keep debating over and over again, should we have done it, really, should we have invaded Iraq in 2003? I think what we should debate is, who the heck thought it would be easy, and why did they think it would be easy? And then, of course, we had the shock of the financial crisis in 2008. And these shocks and disappointments shook our confidence. And it was in this period of time when the Obama administration came in and mainly defined their foreign policy mainly as an opposition to the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq, that the emotional impetus behind our foreign policy shifted from overconfidence, you might say a touch of hubris, and an associated tendency to undervalue and underappreciate the risks and costs of action, to pessimism and resignation, and a tendency to underappreciate and undervalue the risks and costs of inaction and disengagement. Recall the Obama administration's courageous withdrawal from the Middle East. Recall then Vice President Biden calling up President Obama in December 2011 and saying, thank you for allowing me to end this goddamn war. Well, of course, what happened, we know less than 3 years later, is that ISIS, Al-Qaeda 2.0 really, is in control of territory the size of Britain and creates a humanitarian catastrophe of colossal scale that has political ramifications, not only in the Middle East, but also across Europe. So I think it's really important for us to understand the cause of both of the flaws of maybe the Bush administration's undervaluing the cost and risk of action, the Obama administration undervaluing the cost and risk of inaction. I would put the unenforced red line in Syria in that category as well. And the fundamental cause is strategic narcissism and the tendency to recognize, not to recognize, that the other has authorship over the future. So what do we need to do to restore our strategic competence? I think we need, first of all, a strong dose of what the historian Zachary Shore calls strategic empathy. And that is, in particular, paying attention to the emotions, the ideology, and the aspirations that drive and constrain the other. When we don't do that, we engage in strategic narcissism, and we tend to fall into cognitive traps. Cognitive traps associated with linear thinking, with mirror imaging, with confirmation bias, and with optimism bias. And so how do we apply strategic empathy to some of the critical competitions today? And I'll just go through these quickly as a way maybe to jumpstart the conversation, and I'll just comment on the degree to which I think there ought to be continuity or change in the approach to these geostrategic problem sets. First of all, of course, the competition with the Chinese Communist Party. I think for way, way too long, we clung to the assumption that China, having been welcomed into the international order, would play by the rules. And as China prospered, it would liberalize its economy and it would liberalize its form of governance. Okay, we clung to that for too long. The opposite is the case. And I know you talked in a classified forum with Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger. We worked very hard together to effect what we recognized at the time was the greatest shift in US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And that was a shift from the strategy of cooperation and engagement, and I know these labels are only of limited utility, we can talk more about it if you like, to a strategy of transparent competition with the Chinese Communist Party. I think that has to be an element of continuity in a Biden administration. I think if there's any advice I would give to an incoming Biden administration, it would be, do not fall for it. And falling for it would be falling for the empty promises of the Chinese Communist Party, so we can go back to the complacent approach, the accommodating approach we took to China for far, far too long. If you want to know what the stakes are, just look at Australia, right? Australia is really now the object of China's approach to kill one, to scare 100. And what I describe in Battlegrounds is really the need for us to defeat the Chinese Communist Party strategy of co-option, coercion, and concealment, to co-opt countries and companies with the lure of short-term profits, with the lure of Chinese investment. And then once you're in, once they have influence, to coerce you to turn a blind eye to what they're doing internally to extend and tighten their exclusive grip on power through a broad range of means, including cultural genocide in Xinjiang, as well as the extension of the party's repressive arm into Hong Kong, and then to support its aggressive foreign policy. Aggression that I believe has been catalyzed since COVID-19, and we could talk more about that. How do we do that? Of course, we have to defend. We have to compete. We have to re-enter arenas of competition that we vacated based on these flawed assumptions. But we also have to work on ourselves as well. I think, and what I argue in the book, is we need to emphasize turning what China views as weaknesses into our greatest competitive advantages. China views as a weakness the fact that people might want to have a say in how they're governed. So we ought to strengthen our democratic principles and institutions and processes across the free world. China fears rule of law, because if you have rule of law, you can't put 1.5 million people in concentration camps. You can't extinguish their fundamental rights and weaponize their social networks against them. And so we should strengthen rule of law. China feared freedom of speech and of assembly and of the press. We should strengthen our fourth estate. It's actually been investigative reporting that has had some of the greatest impact in countering the Chinese Communist Party's aggressive campaign and attempts to create servile relationships with countries across the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. But what it's really going to take, I think, is the Biden administration to correct, I think, three fundamental misunderstandings about the competition with China. And I'll just go through these very quickly. The first of these is, hey, this is a Washington-Beijing problem, right? And then you'll hear this from people in the region who will say, well, don't force us to choose. Look at what China's doing. Just do a thumbnail sketch of foisting COVID-19 on the world, wolf warrior diplomacy, bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier, the campaign of economic aggression against Australia, increasing aggression in the South China Sea, the threats to Taiwan. Yeah, I could go on. Massive cyber attacks against our medical research facilities in the midst of the pandemic. Okay, now so tell me how this is a Washington, Beijing problem. No, this is a free world China problem. And so when our friends say, don't force us to choose, we're saying we're not forcing you to choose between the United States and China. Your choice is fundamentally between sovereignty and servitude. And so so I think there ought to be very strong elements of continuity with the Biden administration. And the false promises that they're going to offer is, hey, we'll work with you on climate change. Hey, meanwhile, they're building 70 coal-fired plants a year internationally and poisoning the world with carbon emissions. Oh, okay, we'll work with you on North Korea. They're not going to work with us on North Korea. We have a North Korea strategy. They have a U.S. strategy. And that strategy is aimed to use North Korea to push us out of Northeast Asia as the first step of creating exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific and isolating their main regional rival, Japan. So I'm arguing in favor of continuity in China policy. On Russia policy, Russia is also a revisionist power, and this was a big emphasis in the 2017 national security strategy. I jokingly said to a friend who's going to go into the Biden administration, hey, just do a word search for America First, delete it, and you guys should be pretty good with this, right? Because really, we talk about the need to compete with these revisionist powers. Hey, Russia's a different kind of threat. Russia can't compete with us on our own terms. They don't have the economic strength to do it. So what Russia wants to do is to drag everybody else down. So Vladimir Putin is the last man standing in Europe. And they're doing that through a sustained campaign of political subversion against us. And guess what? We're our own worst enemies. Russia is using a campaign of disruption, disinformation, and denial. And when our political leaders compromise our principles to score partisan political points, we help Vladimir Putin in that strategy. Whether it is on one political party in 2016 saying Russia stole the election, or whether it's President Trump now saying that we have widespread fraud in our election system. Both parties have compromised our principles in a way that has aided and abetted Vladimir Putin. And we just have to stop doing that. There are broad ranges of other recommendations in the book, but foremost among them is to impose costs on the Kremlin that exceed those that he factors in at the beginning of his decision-making process. I think, oddly, strangely, the Trump administration has done a great job in that, although the president doesn't acknowledge, that his administration has done that job. So I think because Russia perceives that we're weak and we're divided. Hey, by the way, I don't think they care who wins elections. They don't really care. What they really care about is that a large number of Americans doubt the legitimacy of the result. And we're helping them like every day in that connection. So hey, I won't say more about that. So I just go quickly around the horn here, so to speak. I think if Afghanistan, you already mentioned, Congresswoman, I think it's a disaster. I think it's abhorrent. I think it's actually unethical what we're doing in Afghanistan. St. Thomas Aquinas, taught us, that for a war to be just, you have to have a just end in mind. We abandoned the just end when we essentially partnered with the Taliban against the Afghan government. And we did so, we justified our doing so by really an extreme form of strategic narcissism, of conjuring up the enemy we would prefer in Afghanistan rather than the actual enemy that exists there. And this is the assumption that there's a bold line between the Taliban and other terrorist organizations who want to kill our children and continue a murderous campaign against all civilized peoples. It's this myth, that maybe they want to implement, a more benign form of Sharia when they enter into power sharing relationships. Okay, what does that look like? Is that mass executions in the soccer stadium every other Saturday? Is that every other girls' school bulldozed? So I think that what we need is a corrective in Afghanistan. But of course, paradoxically, sadly, I think the flaws of the Trump administration approach to Afghanistan were essentially those that doubled down on the flaws of the Obama administration. So I hope this is an element of discontinuity with the Biden administration they'll reverse course and recognize, hey, we don't need a huge effort in Afghanistan anymore. Afghans are bearing the brunt of the fight, and there's considerable burden sharing across the coalition. And so this is an insurance policy for us. I could talk more about that if you like. Middle East. Middle East, I think we have to begin to see it as more than a mess to be avoided. And the reason is just when you think, hey, it can't get worse in the Middle East, it actually can. And we saw that. We saw that with the so-called courageous withdrawal of the Middle East during the Obama administration, the unenforced red line, as I mentioned, the complete disengagement from Iraq, and what is a cycle of destructive violence across the region that is fueled based on the interaction between Iranian proxy forces and Salafi jihadist organizations. We can talk more about that, but this is important to our interests really for two fundamental reasons. Problems that start in the Middle East don't stay there. We saw that with the refugee crisis. We saw that how that refugee crisis destabilized Europe as well by really fueling the rise of nativist parties and the interaction between that refugee crisis and polarization in European societies, which is exactly what Putin wants. Again, remember, he wants to be last man standing. So what he's been able to do is he's been able to pour fuel on the crisis of the Syrian civil war, for example, help generate that refugee crisis, and then capitalize on it in Europe as well. And of course, the second big problem that doesn't stay there is jihadist terrorism. And this is the area that we know is extremely important, along with the Khorasan region, emotionally, psychologically, to jihadist terrorist organizations. It's also important because it's vital to the competition with Iran. So I would say an element of continuity in the Middle East is going to be important. And if you want to be a time, remind me to talk about, if you want, Putin's Potemkin peace plan for the Middle East and how that's only made plausible by the belief that the U.S. is going to disengage from the region and that regional actors all hedge against U.S. disengagement. On Iran, I think this should be an element of continuity. I believe that the JCPOA was a political disaster masquerading as a diplomatic triumph. I think that the reason it was a disaster was it neglected two fundamental elements of really strategic empathy, which is first of all, what is the ideology that drives and constrains the real Iranian leaders, right? This is the Supreme Leader, the Guardian Council, and the RGC. And that is the ideology of the revolution. And this is why Iran has waged a 4-decade-long proxy war against us. So whereas to get an agreement, you had to separate that 4-decade-long proxy war against the great Satan, us, the little Satan, Israel, the Arab monarchies, that you can't separate the two because sanctions relief and the payoff that we gave them the resources to intensify that proxy war, to accelerate really the centripetal forces that are tearing the Middle East apart and allowing Iran to apply the Hezbollah model broadly to the region and extend its influence across the region in a way in an effort to push us out and to place a proxy army on the border of Israel. So I think continuity with Iran, that's going to be a stretch for the Biden administration, but these are smart people. I hope they reassess what's occurred since they left and the importance, I think, of keeping the pressure on Iran. I think the overall policy ought to be, we have a headline, force them to choose, right? Hey, you can be a responsible nation, right? You can forswear support for terrorist organizations and reap the benefits of being a responsible nation, but you can't be a sponsor of terrorism and create the problems that you have across the region and attack our interests and threaten Israel, and also have the benefits of being welcomed into the international community and the international economic order. So, hey, Iranian leaders, make a choice. And don't be fooled anymore by the shop window. The shop windows, Zarif and Rouhani, they don't matter. They don't matter. And then finally, North Korea and the overall problem of proliferation associated both with Iran and North Korea. Hey, we never did maximum pressure. We still haven't done it, right? And so I know that there are those who are arguing now, hey, let's go back and repeat the failed pattern of previous efforts to get North Korea to denuclearize. Let's engage in talks. Well, to get to the table, you're gonna have to pay them off somehow, right? Just for the privilege of talking to them. And then, of course, what you're going to encounter there is long drawn out negotiations during which we make concession after concession. We'll end with a weak agreement. And then North Korea, once they've exhausted the payoffs that we gave them, will commit another provocation and repeat the cycle. Is what they do. So let's not do that. Let's at least test the thesis that Kim Jong-un can be convinced that he is safer without the weapons than he is with them. So, I'll just stop there because I want to hear where everybody would like to take the conversation. Again, I think North Korea ought to be an element of continuity. We have not done maximum pressure. And you can talk about climate change if you like. We can talk about energy security, the pandemic and biomedical security, anything you like. But thanks again for the privilege of being with you. The overall team is, the historian Carl Becker said that that anticipation of future, memory of the past and anticipation of future have to walk hand in hand in a happy way. And I think that understanding how the recent past produced the present and the challenges we face is immensely important to making a projection into the future. And I believe our policies also ought to evidence elements of continuity and change between the Trump and Biden administrations. Thank you,
Thank you,
Congresswoman.
General. No, thank you. Thank you so much for your remarks. And just as a reminder to the members of Congress and the members of the press, please signal your interest in speaking by using the raise hand feature of Zoom. I'll recognize you when it's your turn. For staffers and attendees, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we can try to get to that. I'd like to keep it conversational. Maybe I'll take a point of privilege to ask the first question. And I know John Katko also has a question next, and I'll continue to build a queue here. Thank you so much for going around the horn on a lot of the top issues that exist in national security and foreign policy. There's one issue that is of particular interest to me, given that I represent a district in Florida. And this is in our neighborhood, so to speak. You didn't touch on it, and let's just start with Venezuela. I think we can agree that Venezuela under Maduro has created a situation that's bad for his constituents or his countrymen, and one that is, I think, dangerous for the United States, having a failed state in our backyard, not to mention the collaboration that exists with the drug cartels and such that's exporting some of its instability to our country. And, I think my view is that Venezuela and the people of Venezuela will have a hard time succeeding as long as Maduro is in power. He's created a humanitarian and political crisis and creating some regional instability. Where would you fall on that continuity or change when it comes to our current policy towards Venezuela?
I would say mainly continuity and maybe with some improvements to the policy. So I think when we framed the Venezuela policy, we said, okay, we want, the overall purpose is to restore the constitutional government, right, in Venezuela. So to do that, we had to pursue it with three objectives that are sometimes in tension with one another. The first of those objectives would be to weaken and isolate the Maduro regime, and to reduce his ability to maintain his grip on power. The second of these was to strengthen the opposition, right? So that there is a viable opposition. We thought just after I left, but with Guaido, that really had occurred, right? This is somebody who could relate to the Chavistas, right, and those who have been disadvantaged previously and so forth. He wasn't a member of the Caracas Polo Club. Some of the other members of the opposition were, right? And then the third objective would be to ensure that Venezuelans trace their grievances back to Maduro, right? And so that third objective is what tempered the degree to which we imposed sanctions, for example, on Venezuelan companies and especially oil exports in particular, because we didn't want Maduro to be able to blame the gringos, for the problems, and instead, for the people to be able to recognize that this is a criminalized government and network that is accelerating the country toward utter state collapse and a humanitarian catastrophe. It already is actually a humanitarian catastrophe. So I think that those three objectives are still valid. What we do differently, I think now it's important to work on the problem from the outside in. What is keeping Maduro on life support? It's external support by three authoritarian regimes, really four authoritarian regimes: Cuba, Russia, China, and Iran. And I think that we ought to impose secondary sanctions on those financial institutions and commercial entities that are engaged in support for Maduro. And then I think the second aspect of this is to go after the Black economy, and to do so with a range of financial actions and tracing, exposing that Black economy. And this is how he's staying on life support, essentially. And then, I think rather than endorsing any one political leader, as we did with Guaido, that might have been a mistake. But I mean, I think we stick with him now. He's recognized by 60-some countries. And we have to be obviously prepared for an acceleration of the humanitarian crisis and the effects maybe on Brazil and Colombia in particular, and Peru. So I think it's going to be, it's not going to be easy, but I think working on it from the outside in and taking actions against the Black economy ought to be top of the agenda. But I think it ought to be an effort at continuity. I think trying to beat sanctions now and negotiate directly with Maduro, I think that might be problematic if we accede to his demands as the price for negotiations.
Great, thank you, General. In my queue, I have John Katko, Kathleen Rice, and Warren Davidson. I'll yield the floor to John.
Thank you very much for having this, Stephanie, and thank you very much, Mr. McMaster, for everything as well. I was recently made head of the ranking member for the Homeland Security Committee starting in January, and I have a lot of concerns from a foreign policy standpoint and how they impact the homeland here. You pick up the paper this morning and there's another major terrorist attack that's been revealed. So I think cyber terrorism is going to be a huge problem going forward. But I appreciate all you said and all the things you highlighted as concerns around the horn. But I have two questions for you. One is, what is the greatest concern about the incoming administration based on what you've learned? I hear things about them wanting to go back into the Iran nuclear deal and some of the other things. So what's your greatest concern about what you're hearing that the new administration might do? And secondly, and it's very distinct, and that is, what's the impact of the peace agreements, if any? How significant are the peace agreements between Israel and the Arab states that they've been entering into recently? And how does that affect the balance of power? And how does it affect the possibility for real lasting peace in the Middle East? So with that, I yield back. I want to say thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you. Well, I'm not that concerned that there's going to be discontinuity in the approach to China. I think even if the Biden administration were, and I think the people that are coming in the administration are too smart for this. I mean, I think even if they did believe the Chinese Communist Party's false promises of cooperation and alleviated the pressure, the actions of Xi Jinping is going to be the main element of continuity, right? Because I think there's a real crisis on the way on Taiwan, and it may not happen before the 2022 Communist Party Congress and the Winter Olympics, but I think maybe right after that. You remember the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine happened during Sochi, right? I think it's a period of increasing danger with Xi Jinping. He's going to be more and more aggressive. Look what he's doing to Australia, right? So anyway, I'm not that concerned about that. What I am concerned about is a continuation of the Trump administration's belief, right, that disengagement from these complex problem sets abroad is an unmitigated good. And I think there'll be a lot of drive toward that, right? Because we're emerging from a quadruple crisis of a pandemic, the recession associated with the pandemic, the social divisions laid bare by George Floyd's murder and the aftermath, and concerns of inequality of opportunity and unequal treatment under the law. And then, of course, this vitriolic partisan political season, but we're still stuck mired in, right? And so I think there'll be a tendency to be introspective and to say, hey, we have to focus inward for a while, right? Forget that stuff overseas. But the pandemic should have taught us that problems that develop overseas, if they're not dealt with there, can only be dealt with at an exorbitant price once they reach our shores. And so I think an argument for engagement overall, and this is in particular in connection with South Asia and the Middle East. So I guess that would be the biggest concern.
Great, thank you. With that, I'll yield the floor to Kathleen Rice.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you so much for being here with us today. This is really enlightening. John Katko and I both serve on Homeland Security. And I tell you, they just added DHS to the list of federal agencies that were hacked. on top of Treasury and Commerce. And I thought that your comment before about how, both sides are engaging in this rhetoric that is not helpful. Democrats saying in 2016 that the Russians, stole the election basically and got Donald Trump elected. And of course, the rhetoric that's going on right now based around disinformation and misinformation. How do we wrap our head around it? Do you think CISA is a good starting point to kind of use as our perfecting our cybersecurity interest, not just here domestically, but obviously internationally as well? And just your thoughts on that. How do you, the whole disinformation and misinformation campaign, and how would you address that?
Right. Okay,
Assuming that the Biden administration is not going to be purveyors of misinformation and disinformation campaigns.
Right. So, so CISA is a great start. I mean, this is what I couldn't understand. I mean, Chris Krebs did a great job, and got fired. I mean, and I think, it's too bad President Trump didn't take credit. I mean, I think this is something we started in 2017. It's a real success story, as you know. In fact, I mean, tremendous results delivered by the 2018 election, even better results by the 2020 election. So this is a great example of how we can compensate, for what are some of our vulnerabilities, right? One of our vulnerabilities is we don't respond well to central direction. Okay, I mean, the pandemic showed that, but of course we have like 54 different electoral systems across the states and territories. But what we did is we established federal standards and we provided resources to help those other entities, the states and territories, meet those standards. And then somebody who was dynamic like Chris Krebs developed the personal relationships and the trust, so that we could work together toward common objectives. That's what we're going to need across really just infrastructure security and the full range of cyber threats that we're facing. I tend to think about cyber threats in about 4 different categories, right? One of those are direct attacks on infrastructure. Some of the most dramatic ones that we know from a historical perspective are the 2007 Iranian attacks, for example. I cover all these in Battlegrounds if you want a few paragraphs on it, but that attacked our financial sector. Well, hey, we learned from that, right? We really ramped up the resiliency of those systems, and that's a good model to be applied overall. But as you know, a lot of our infrastructure is vulnerable. Because transportation infrastructure, other power infrastructure, and so forth. So that we need to provide incentives, which really don't exist right now, to invest in defenses and in resiliency. All of our systems need to have the ability to degrade gracefully rather than fail catastrophically. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, what they did is they attacked the power grid, but the power grid was not yet modernized. So the guy in his coveralls, walked in the back room and throws the big switch, and the power came back on. We're not incentivized to do that because we're incentivized for cost efficiency. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why we had such a big problem on PPE during COVID, because our supply chains were all biased in favor of efficiency rather than resiliency. So what is the equivalent of that in cyber defense and infrastructure, and how do we provide the incentives from the government perspective, to be able to build in that resiliency? The second big category is cyber espionage, theft of data, infiltration of our systems, and what we're recognizing now is the degree to which companies, the Chinese Communist Party, the advanced persistent threats associated with them, Russians and others, they view our tech companies, our communications companies, as a house they want to break into. And they will do everything. So, hey, first they'll come in the front door. Hey, we'll bolt the front door. Then they'll come in the window. Then they're going to infiltrate people. And I think the private sector is waking up to this. I think what is really, really, really important is that the Department of Justice and everyone who's working on this problem forge very good working relationships with the private sector. Now, my limited experience, I live in Silicon Valley now. I've got full disclosure, I'm on the Zoom board, right? But my sense is that these companies want to do the right thing, and they're beyond the Snowden stuff in this. I mean, they really want to work with not only the U.S. DOJ, but other entities that are going to help them maintain the trust of their customers, right? Because maintaining the trust of their customers and their customers knowing that their data is like gold And these companies are going to treat that data like they're Fort Knox, right? I mean, that's the business model. That aligns with our security interests. I don't see any divergence there. So I think, that in terms of cyber espionage, defending against it, I think we're pulling the curtain back on it. There have been a lot of good studies. There's the Hoover Institution, I think, is doing a great job with this China Global Sharp Power Initiative. That's where I am now. It's at Hoover. They just did a great report on industrial espionage. So I think that we're getting better at that, but that's the second threat, right? And that's going to really that is more a private sector threat than a government threat, but it's going to require the integration of our intelligence capabilities and our law enforcement capabilities and our cyber capabilities with the private sector. We have to work together. Organizations like MITRE can play a big role there, right? MITRE can as a government funded think tank with really extraordinary expertise, it can help, I think, help the private sector along in this area. And of course, there's tremendous private sector expertise that we need in the government. One of the biggest things I think you could do in Congress is to make it easier for experts to move back and forth between government service and the private sector. So that, we have some recommendations on that I can send. The third key area is cyber-enabled information warfare, which you asked about. And of course, the first aspect of this is pulling the curtain back on it, right? To expose it to everyone, to show who these agents are, to say, hey, this is what's coming from the IRA. There's a self-policing function associated with that to take down really foreign entities' efforts to influence in a way that's a threat to us. The private sector is doing some of that, but of course, this is complicated because who wants Facebook executives to be the arbiters of free speech, right? So we have to come up with a solution to that aspect of it. But I think what's most important of anything else is the education of the American people, so we are better inoculated against cyber-enabled information warfare. And I think we need the fourth estate. We can't do it from a government perspective or a private. I mean, they have to reform themselves, right? I mean, how is it that if you lean one way politically, you watch one cable news station? If you lean the other way, you watch one or two others. There is not kind of a common source of authoritative information that all of us go to. So now it's magnified even further, right? By social media, whose business model is to polarize us by getting us to click on more and more ads, and to do so by showing us more and more extreme information. So social media is pulling apart from each other. And then you have the pseudo media, right? Which is, showing all these conspiracy theories about, widespread election fraud or QAnon on the one hand, or far left-wing propaganda on the other, right? And so, I mean, we're really more vulnerable to this maybe than at any time. The answer is education, and I think the answer is also kind of maybe a reinvigoration of journalistic standards. I don't know, but I cover this in the book. I think instead of trying to shut down every bad site, we need to find out what is authoritative and bring people's attention to that. And the fourth area is cyber crime, right? And this is if you're looking for state actors, this is where North Korea is the main state actor in cyber crime, and that also takes a broad range of capabilities to counter. Overall, what we need to do is obviously ensure that our systems are resilient and can degrade gracefully. And I think we've already made maybe one of the biggest and most significant changes in policy, which is in recognition that a good defense requires a good offense. And I just think we all ought to feel super fortunate that sometimes the government gets it right and puts the right person in the right place at the right time. I think Chris Krebs was that, but I also think Paul Nakasone is that as well. I'll tell you, I would just ask him what to do and just do whatever. I mean, the guy is, I think, the most competent person who, that I know of in this field, and he's in the right place to affect in improving our defenses.
Thank you. Up next, I have your fellow West Point grad and our fellow Board of Visitors member, Warren Davidson, and then I have Mr. Case and Mr. Costa after that. Warren, go ahead.
General McMaster, thanks for really a lifetime of service to our nation and some quality work here. Appreciate the overview that you just ran through. One of the comments you made is, who would have thought that it would be easy with respect to the decisions with Afghanistan and Iraq, the kind of post 9/11 effort. And I would say, at least in the early days, not so much DOD. You recall, of course, that General Eric Shinseki was fired for essentially giving an honest answer to Congress on the cost, duration, and complexity of the mission in Iraq. So in your book, Dereliction of Duty, you called attention to the civil-military dynamics that produced America's quagmire in Vietnam. So my question, in what ways are America's quagmire in, quote, endless wars in Afghanistan and Iraq similar? I love the way General Milley says that armies don't go to war, nations do. So absent action from Congress, America's military has remained at ill-defined wars for a long stretch now. In my opinion, this dereliction of duty by Congress accounts for much of the yo-yo effect that we've referenced between one administration to the next, where there's clear contrast in viewpoints. We've essentially stayed at war by using raw domestic political power rather than by building true political consensus in the legislature. So in the end, collaboration is the tough work for building a grand strategy in our current political system. So I guess what is similar and what's different between the quagmires you've discussed today and those you described in dereliction of duty? And I'll yield the rest of my time.
I think what is similar. Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. Yeah, what I think is similar is a persistent, tendency to take a short-term approach to long-term problems, and thereby to lengthen the war and make the war more costly, right? And so, in Vietnam, President Lyndon Johnson, he was basing his decisions mainly on his domestic political priorities. Get elected in '64, pass Great Society in '65. So he viewed Vietnam mainly as a danger to those goals. So he wanted a strategy. Hey, give me a strategy that doesn't force me to make a difficult choice that could alienate key constituencies on which my domestic agenda depends, right? And so what did Robert McNamara do? What did others do? They said, okay, we'll give you what you want. And so they gave the president the advice he wanted on Vietnam. And that was a tremendous disservice to him and, of course, the nation, right? And so, I tried to put in place a process that wouldn't do that, right? That would tell the president, give the president multiple options and give access to best analysis. It would take a long-term view. And what the outcome we got? The outcome we got was the South Asia strategy of August of 2017 that went against the president's predilections. And in that speech, he wrote in the speech, hey, I was going to get out, but, right, after I sat behind the desk in the Oval Office, And so I think that's what we owe any president is best advice. And especially advice that includes a description of this challenge, this threat to our security on its own terms, a view of that challenge through the lens of vital interests, so we can answer the so what question of the American people. Hey, why do the American people care about this threat or this challenge? And then an important step, which is to craft very clear objectives. In Vietnam, it was weird walking into George Bundy's office, right? When as National Security Advisor the first day, I was determined at least not to make the same mistakes. But George Bundy argued on the run to the Vietnam War, hey, it's better not to have an objective, because that way, if we fail, we can say, hey, that was never our objective anyway. And that will, quote, give President Johnson, more flexibility in the domestic political arena. So another aspect of this is you kind of have to wall off decisions that involve life and death from partisan politics and builds a bipartisan degree of consensus and at least a willingness to work together on problems that involve war, and the commitment of not only treasure but also American blood. And so I think this was a flaw that was similar to the flaw in Afghanistan, in that we had this short-term approach to long-term problem. Hey, it's not a 20-year war there; it's a one-year war, 20 times over. And it is that short-term approach, and I go into a lot more detail in the book about this, about these strategies and inconsistency in them. And of course, what the American people need to know, I think they need to know two things. Why the hell do they care? What is at stake? And secondly, what is a strategy that will deliver a favorable outcome at a cost that is acceptable to them? And I think our leaders have failed over multiple administrations. So, hey, I don't blame the American people for losing faith in the effort. I blame our leaders for not telling them what is at stake and what is the strategy that will deliver that outcome. As many adopted this narrative of endless wars and to get out of Afghanistan as an end of itself, we had 8,500 troops there. That is a minuscule number of troops. And the numbers of troops that we have deployed abroad right now is at a historic low, lower than any time before World War II. The other thing to recognize is in the first half of this year, 10 of our courageous soldiers made the ultimate sacrifice in Afghanistan. But we should also note that about 30 Afghan soldiers and police give their lives every day to defend the freedoms that they've enjoyed since 2001 and to prevent the Taliban from again controlling territory that could be used by jihadist terrorists as a safe haven and support base. We should also note that that number of U.S. troops was below the number of other coalition troops in Afghanistan. So in the area of burden sharing, cost management, risk that we're taking and sacrifices we're making, I believe that was a sustainable commitment and worth it as an insurance policy of what I think is almost bound to happen based on our withdrawal. But you know what? Nobody was making that case. So, I mean, how do you blame the American people for that? I don't. I think there has been a tendency recently to view popular will and support for efforts overseas as inflexible, right? As immutable. But it's not immutable. I mean, if you talk to the American people and explain what's at stake, I think you can garner the political will necessary to implement a strategy that's in our long-term interests. Thank you.
Thank you. With the remaining time, we have 2 questions left. So what I'd love to do is just have both Ed and Jim ask your questions, and then we'll turn it over to the general to answer in the remaining time. With that, I'll yield the floor to Ed for the first question.
Hello, General. I'm coming to you from Hawaii, exactly equidistant between DC and Beijing, and we tend to look to our west as much as to our east here. So let me follow on the China comments you've made. I've applied your strategic empathy to China, and in some ways it seems pretty straightforward and simple. Ruthless practicality intended to maintain power in the party as well as to fulfill a sense of global entitlement. And in that way, maybe it's a little more simple than Iran, which is complicated with, religion and jihadism and kind of different tensions. And in that context, my question to you is, given our strategic empath as to them and theirs as to us, is there a win-win at all? Or are we just kind of, destined to kind of have a come to Jesus Cold War moment in which the decision is made one way or the other? I don't want to admit that is the case, but it seems to be unavoidable at some level. And in relation to that, you went around the world, but I think a critical part of that is India. And the question with India, it seems to me, is that are India's days of holding on to non-alignment and to neutrality over in this context?
Thanks, Ed. And then Jim, did you want to briefly ask your question, and then we'll turn it back over to the general to answer?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie, for hosting this. I think it's always very informative. And General, thank you for your service to our country. We share a similar acquaintance. Victor Hansen has told me about the years you and he have worked together. But my question is, as we move to a new administration, from an American first policy in which multilateralism was looked down upon, if not disdained. The European Union was our adversary. NATO was looked on more as an accounting basis as opposed to a common shared values and a defense that has offered 71 years of peace that is in our interest in Europe and a hedge against Russia. Where do you see a return to repair the damage that has occurred, I think, with some of our allies who question what our reliance is today in terms of our treaties, in terms of our joint shared values and commitments, whether we're talking about Afghanistan, Iraq, or whether we're talking about confronting Russia or China?
Great. Well, what great questions. Okay, so first of all, and I think you're just dead on in terms of what they're motivated by. What I write in the book is that it's fear and ambition, right? Fear of losing control and their ambition, to take center stage in the world, using Xi Jinping's word from the speech in October of 2017, Party Congress. And so what do we do? What do we do about that? I mean, I think what we have to do is we have to compete. We have to compete in a transparent manner. We have to re-enter arenas of competition that we have vacated based on the flawed assumptions of the past. And we have to convince the Chinese Communist Party leadership that they can have enough of their dream without victimizing their own people or pursuing national rejuvenation at our expense and promoting their authoritarian mercantilist model that places our nations, our citizens in a position of disadvantage. So I think the way to do that is to ramp up, and this gets to Jim's question, multinational cooperation on this. Actually, I mentioned there are three misunderstandings for our policy. I only got to one. I forgot to mention here too. The second one is that there really is already a lot of international cooperation on this, and I think that the opportunity is there for the Biden administration, to expand on a lot of that cooperation that's already been ongoing. And I won't go into the details of it, but I think that this is an area to exploit as well. And I think about our approach to China in connection with maybe the 3 C's, right? So their strategy is cooption, coercion, and concealment, right? And our 3 C's, I think, are our competition. That we have to compete effectively, and competing effectively is the best way to avoid confrontation. The third misunderstanding is that we face this Thucydides trap, right? This false dilemma. Hey, the party loves using that, by the way, because it basically poses us with a false choice of either accommodation and passivity or a disastrous war. Hey, well, plenty that we can do in between those 2 extremes to compete effectively in a transparent manner and to do it, as I mentioned, with like-minded partners. And of course, highlighting that first misunderstanding that, hey, this is a choice between sovereignty and servitude. Which one are you going to pick? And so I think it's, again, convincing them they can have enough of their dream, without egregious, human rights violations and a campaign of cultural genocide, for example, in Xinjiang, or pursuing their interests at our expense, right? But it's going to take us, we have to do a lot more. We have to stop underwriting our own demise or allowing Wall Street to do so. We could talk about that for hours. So on India, India is part of Jim's question as well, Ed, is in that India is ready. I mean, they're ready, and we ought to cooperate with us in an unprecedented manner, and to lose a bit of the reticence associated with the legacy of the non-aligned movement and the strong strain of anti-colonialism that tends to color their view of the West. And so I think we're a little bit immune from that. I mean, it's usually the UK that's the object of that. But I think that the reason we ought to send this back to Xi Jinping, because he convinced them that they have to compete with us. Now, how do we do that? First of all, I think we have to pull them into the fold along with the other biggest economies in the world, especially Japan and the EU, which gets to Jim, and set an agenda. Set an agenda associated with something called the T10, in a way to develop technologies and share technologies in a way that maintain our competitive advantages, but then also in standard setting. Standard setting in terms of data standards are going to be crucial to the data-driven emerging global economy, as well as internet privacy standards, for example. Those maybe ought to be like top of the agenda. And what we can do, we can take some of the TPP work, recognizing there's probably unlikely to be a multilateral trade agreement, but then apply that work, more broadly among all of us. And then China can't do the divide and conquer thing that they do if we work together. The other thing on India is that India has to succeed for the world to succeed, right? Because if there's even a small problem in India, it's a big problem for the world, just in scale. And as this has to do with the interconnected problems of climate, energy, food security, water security, and health security. I think there should be a major initiative between the US, Japan, and the EU. India's got to get off coal. They got to get off coal. Hey, guess what? We can help with that with LNG, for example. And I should disclose, hey, I work with a company called Sempra Energy, which is involved now in LNG. I'm not saying that for that reason, but I've joined it because I'm a big believer that LNG, just like it did for us, can help the world realize historic reductions in carbon emissions as we continue to transition to renewables. For example, I think next generation nuclear is another big initiative. If you look at what companies like General Atomics, and again, I have no relationship with them, but I visited in research for my book, what they're doing on next generation nuclear is astounding, right? And with just a little bit more investment, I mean, I think we can get at that problem. And then the food and water security issues associated with the degree to which agriculture and irrigation and so forth affects both food and water security and environmental. I mean, anyway, I would just say huge initiatives should be on India. The diplomatic initiative ought to make sure that the BJP doesn't pursue Hindu nationalist policies in a way that jumpstarts kind of a sectarian conflict there, which would be a disaster. So anyway, India should be top of the list. I covered it in the book, and I should have mentioned it. But that's a great point, and ought to be on the Biden administration's top of their agenda as well. Jim, on your point on allies, I've heard the administration emphasize allies. That's really good. But hey, it's got to be more than about the mood music, you know, or the atmosphere at cocktail parties with our European allies, right? So, I mean, it has to be about what are the alliances for? How do we make them more effective in accomplishing our common goals? And I think we mentioned a lot of what those common goals ought to be today. So I think alliances for purpose, and then clarifying early in your hearings and your oversight responsibilities. Hey, you know, what is your agenda for our alliances? Some of the alliances are stronger than ever. I would say with Japan, with India, with Israel, and you mentioned the Abraham Accords, which I think is a huge opportunity and needs to be followed up with by the Biden administration. What I'm afraid of is that there will be again this drive to disengage from the Middle East as an unmitigated good. In fact, I have to say, I think one of the reasons why UAE and Bahrain in particular signed up for the Abraham Accords was to hedge against the Biden administration. I think they thought, hey, you know, our security interests aligned with the IDF, you know, and American leads, you know, we probably need to work closely with vis-a-vis the Iranian threat in particular. But there are, of course, more reasons than that. I think what the benefit of this is, it's a check to Iranian aggression. It's an end. It's the beginning of an end toward imminent IMMANENT hostility toward Israel, and it also removes or blocks kind of ideological support, some of the ideological support for jihadist terrorists, because it just shows, hey, we're all people of the book here. This is not a religious war. People are jihadist terrorists, irreligious criminals who are using a perverted interpretation of Islam to pursue criminal and political agendas. And so anyway, I think it's all good. It ought to be expanded through active diplomacy and a Biden administration. This would be of continuity. The last thing I'll say on multinational, hey, if COVID taught us anything, there's no prize for membership in international organizations, right? I mean, you know, these organizations are oftentimes competitive arenas with hostile countries that are subverting those organizations and trying to turn them against their purpose, like the WHO, like the Human Rights Council, you know, like UNESCO, you know, like the International Civil Aviation Organization, right? I mean, the list goes on. So I think that we have to recognize, like global governance, I mean, they're meaningless, they're aspirational, they're delusional, right? We are in the competitions. And in those competitions, it is in our interest to galvanize multinational efforts in our favor, in the favor of our free and open societies against closed authoritarian systems. Denying membership, you know, and belief in global governance, we've got to jettison that and the language associated with it as well. Thank you, Jim. Ned.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, General McMaster. It looks like we're at time for our event, but I just want to say, you know, deeply thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It was a terrific way for us to start really thinking about how to pursue bilateral action on the foreign policy and national security front in this next Congress. I also want to thank the members of Congress and the many staffers and other audience members who joined us. I hope you'll continue to join us at our next session in early 2021. And I hope everyone has a safe and happy holiday. And thanks again for being with us today. This was a great conversation.